In 2023, in the UK, we live in a time when there are a ton of brilliant guitar bands with brilliant music. But all of them are kind of under the surface. None of them are really breaking through to the mainstream like the great rock and roll acts that came before. So today we are going to be looking at 4 of the greatest British bands in history, all of which managed to hit that top spot to become the biggest band in the UK and bring rock and roll back into the mainstream. In analysing how the great musical heroes of the past did it, I've noticed 4 specific keys that all of them had to unlock the door to the very top of the rock and roll world. Some of those keys are really obvious, and others much, much less so. The 4 bands we're going to be looking at in relation to those 4 keys are the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, the Sex Pistols and Oasis. So let's start off with the biggest British band of all time, the Beatles. And because we're mainly focusing on what it takes to get to the top, we're going to look at them in their first phase when they were on the rise, rather than later on when they were already at the top. The era of the first 5 albums particularly, Please Please Me through to Help. So, what did the Beatles have? What were those 4 keys that allowed them to unlock rock and roll superstardom? Well, the first one is one of the really obvious ones. They had great songs. It doesn't matter how cool you are, how much attitude you have, how many podcasts or articles feature you, or how big your social media following is, if you don't have the songs. Weirdly, however, that isn't the biggest problem with the first key. The biggest problem with it is that many musicians and bands think it's the only one. They think if they could just write a song with the magic, then their destiny at the top of the rock and roll world would be assured, which of course is completely wrong. There are already countless incredibly talented artists and musicians composing amazing music all over the world. But sadly, most of their songs will never really get heard by the general public. I've said it before that I've heard incredible singer-songwriters performing some of the best music I've ever heard to half-empty pubs. I remember one specific old fella with missing teeth performing in a pub who had some songs that were quite literally better than the Beatles. They never took him anywhere beyond the 4 walls of that pub, however. Great songs are absolutely essential, but on their own, they are never enough. So now let's get a little bit deeper. Let's look at the second key. The Beatles didn't just have great songs, they also had a specific and unique signature sound. On the first 5 albums particularly, every single track sounds like the Beatles. Instrumentally speaking, they really didn't embrace much variety in this era. They had Ringo playing his fairly simple drum beats, almost always backed by clean Rickenbacker guitars and sometimes an electric 12-string, always played clean. For most of the first 5 albums, you could remove the vocals and listen to the backing tracks, and they would all sound pretty much the same, instrumentally speaking. The chords might change, the tempo might change, but the arrangement was almost always identical. Variation in the sound came later on, in the second half of their career, but in that first period when they were on the rise, there was almost none. But the biggest and most important element of their signature sound was not actually the instrumental backing. It was their vocals sung in unapologetically 60s Scouse accents. All 4 of the Beatles had a unique character voice, and when you hear one of them singing over that instrumental backing, it can only ever be one band. For most of their songs from this era, you could hear one of their tracks on the radio, never having heard it before, and immediately know it was them. And now we come on to the third key. This one is, in my opinion, the most important and the most neglected. The Beatles were not just musicians, performers and songwriters. Everything they did, both on and off stage, was shot through with a counter-cultural message. In post-war Britain at the start of the 60s, everything was still very straight-laced and neo-Victorian. Most men had short, neat, oiled hair and were very socially conservative. They'd been kind of forced into that way of thinking and living by the Second World War. Away from idealistic thinking and confronted with the harsh realities of human nature. The Beatles, however, had much longer unkempt hair, and their music, by the standards of the time, was really raw and aggressive. It was unlike anything else in the mainstream and was labelled beat music because it was driven by the drums and guitar. But it wasn't just their look and their music that was countercultural. Off stage as well, they consistently broke the mould. The lifestyle and message that the Beatles modelled was something that the young people of the 1960s were desperately waiting for. It was almost as if the Beatles sensed the secret longing of the silent majority and then just showed up saying what everyone was thinking. And it was like opening a floodgate. They basically became the heralds, the spokesmen and the representatives of this new counterculture. Think of British culture as a swinging pendulum. It swings to one extreme, and once there, this position becomes the new normal. Over time, people get sick of normal and start getting hungry for change. And then someone or something comes along and knocks the pendulum back the other way. A cultural revolution. But once the pendulum reaches the other side and settles in and becomes the new normal again, after time passes, people start getting bored with normal once more. And so the cycle repeats, with the pendulum swinging from side to side as each generation passes. By sensing the public mood and tying in their music and message to what everyone was thinking and feeling, the Beatles unlocked something incredibly powerful and emotive. And you can see that's true because the reaction of the young people of the day was borderline hysterical. Young women in particular would scream non-stop in the audience at Beatles gigs to the point that the music itself was actually completely drowned out. That was in fact one of the reasons they stopped touring in the end. Neither they or the audience could actually hear a single note they were playing or singing. The countercultural movement that they started and led had become so absolutely massive that the music almost didn't matter anymore. The Beatles could have been stood on stage singing Three Blind Mice. But because the Beatles songs were tied in to a cultural revolution, they became something more than songs. They became music in which vast amounts of emotional meaning for millions of people were tied up. Their songs effectively became the soundtrack to the revolution. And that made their songs timeless. I bet you can't name very many songs from the charts in 1963, but I bet you know the Beatles ones. Is Love Me Do a better song, technically speaking, than anything else in the charts in '63? Not in the slightest. But because it meant so much to so many people, that's the one that became timeless, and the other better written songs have been forgotten in the mists of time. Imagine what Please Please Me or Love Me Do would be today without the social revolution. Just quaint, unremarkable little ditties forgotten in the past, like so much of the other music released before and after the Beatles. And the fourth and final key is connected to the third, and once again it's one that most bands don't really understand or incorrectly write off as superficial and silly. The Beatles had a dress code. And this wasn't just so they looked good on stage or TV or in photos. The Beatles' presentation was a stroke of absolute genius on the part of Brian Epstein, their manager, because it meant that young people who liked them and felt represented by them had a way of joining the revolution. They didn't need to pay a formal subscription, they just bought the records. They didn't need a formal uniform, they just got a Beatles haircut and they were part of it. Absolute genius. And you can see just how successful the Beatles really were with their message and movement, because by the mid-60s everyone had a Beatles haircut. They swept the board, succeeded, and won the culture war. The Beatles successfully ushered in all the changes that they represented. But that brings me neatly on to the last point on the Beatles, how the rock and roll top spot can only ever be held by definition for just a short while. Once a band succeeds in becoming the biggest band in Britain, in leading the cultural revolution, and everyone else jumps on the bandwagon, guess what? They're not revolutionary anymore. Because they won, they become the new normal, and gradually, over time, become the new boring. And so, someone else has to rise up and usher in the next change. The Beatles, however, maintained their positions as the leaders of cultural change in Britain arguably for 5 years, from 63 to 67, which was a very long reign at the top. Because it was around 1967, starting in San Francisco in the States, that the next cultural revolution began to emerge. The Beatles had personally led the previous one, but in this new one, they became followers. They jumped on the bandwagon. This was the hippie revolution, and the Beatles actually arguably released all their best music in this era, but they were no longer really leading the charge. Which brings us on to band number 2, Led Zeppelin. By 1967, the cultural pendulum that the Beatles had set into motion was now moving so far and so fast that it was in fact moving beyond the scope of what the Beatles themselves represented. Mop tops morphed into long, unkempt, straggly hair that had never seen a comb. The pendulum was moving towards its far opposite side now, as distant as it was possible to get from strict formality and the stiff upper lip. However, unlike the Beatles, who actually started their revolution, Zeppelin didn't start the hippie flower power movement, but they arose from within it, and became its leaders and cultural representatives in this country. And they're particularly interesting to me because it looks from the outside like they never particularly set out to be the leaders. They just were. So now let's look at the 4 keys in the case of Led Zeppelin and see how they became the biggest rock and roll band in Britain. Key number 1 is great songs. Of course, the songwriting partnership of Page and Plant produced many classics that have definitely stood the test of time. I don't think there are many people out there who would seriously say that the writers of Stairway to Heaven were not exceptional. So, Zeppelin definitely had the first key, but they wrote their songs in a very different way to what had come before. The Beatles had constantly released singles, keeping many of their songs in that first era short, snappy and poppy, under 3 minutes long. Led Zeppelin never released any singles whatsoever, except a few, against their wishes, overseas. In stark contrast to the Beatles, they chose to release albums only, and many of their songs were actually over 8 minutes long. And while the Beatles in their early years appealed mainly to young screaming teenage girls, Led Zeppelin had a much wider appeal. Led Zeppelin also had the second key, a signature sound. At the time, Jimmy Page's guitar tone was one of the heaviest sounds ever to have been made by a British band. Led Zepp 2 is a great example of their main signature sound. At the time, many people considered it the first heavy metal album, although by today's standards it's just classic rock, because they spawned so many imitators. But primarily, once again, it was mainly the unique vocal sound of the lead singer, Robert Plant, that really gave Zeppelin their instantly recognisable sound. A character vocal. The Beatles had Liverpudlian accents and close 3-part harmony, and Robert Plant had his unique, super high Zeppelin wail. Almost every song on Led Zepp 2 contains both of those signature elements, Jimmy Page's raucous driving guitar and Robert Plant's wail. But now let's look at the really interesting one, key number 3, the magic and alchemy by which a set of songs by a good band becomes something more than that, turning into something profound and timeless for millions of people. The previous generation had been battle-hardened soldiers, tough as nails, fighting for their very existence in the trenches of Europe. As if a reaction against this, the new generation that Zeppelin represented became staunchly pacifist. Where their parents had been forged in fire, unyielding, standing alone against a terrible enemy, they became a little bit soft maybe, non-confrontational and quite self-pitying. Where their parents had largely lived according to the idea of a nuclear family, they embraced the concept of free love, meaning having as much unprotected sex as you want with as many partners as you want, as often as you want, and sod the consequences. So, within the space of just a few decades, British culture had gone from men and women bearing the burden of ultimate responsibility on their shoulders to the throwing off of all responsibility.
And I just hang out, you know. I don't like to work too often, unless it's for something groovy.
You ever had a job?
Yeah.
What?
I was at business school once, California. Worked in an advertising agency, J. Walter Thompson in New York. I was there. That faded away.
Well, what took its place?
Took its place poetry, songs, painting, drawing mandalas. Just roaming around, talking to the trees.
Listen to these lyrics from their song, Dancing Days. Dancing days are here again as the summer evenings grow. I got my flower, I got my power, I got a woman who knows. There's Zeppelin openly singing about flower power.
Oh, well, you know, it's just groovy, man. There's a new species emerging, right? And the new species, they have their different forms of culture, you know. It's a whole new thing, you know. And when you see things like this happen, it's far out, you know.
They were consistently quite strongly attacked by the mainstream media of the time, criticised and given poor reviews. The people, however, as is so common in situations like these, loved them nonetheless and took them to their hearts. In any given generation, generally speaking, the media, the press will pretty much just parrot whatever the pendulum says. So, when a new movement is starting, when there are instigators pushing that pendulum away, usually they criticise them until the pendulum is over here, at which point they look back on them fondly and re-evaluate their initial opinions. And Zeppelin were no exception to this rule. Loved by the people, loathed by the press, nonetheless their music, because of what it represented, transcended music and became the soundtrack of the people. And of course, key number 4, the hippie movement well and truly had a dress code, which Led Zeppelin fully embraced and modelled. Long hair, open shirts, headbands, flares, and all that hippie gear. So important was the hippie dress code to that movement that John Lennon himself, in his song Gimme Some Truth, identifies politicians and hypocrites as being people who wore their hair short. Zeppelin arguably maintained their position as cultural leaders and the biggest band in Britain actually longer than the Beatles, arguably for 6 years, 1970 to 1975. Just as the Beatles had won their culture war and become normal, so had the hippies. And as hippie culture became the new normal and gradually then became the new boring, the stage was set for the next generation of revolutionaries. Some might consider that the hippie prog movement reached its zenith when Bohemian Rhapsody by Queen hit number 1 in 1975. That culture was starting to peak and to have nowhere left to go but down. Which brings us on now to the Sex Pistols. By the mid to late 70s, a new generation were arising which hated prog, hated the hippies and rejected everything they stood for. The new generation was bored by them, bored by their music and bored by what they stood for. The scene was set for the rise of the punks. Johnny Rotten was famously wearing a ripped Pink Floyd t-shirt when he first met Malcolm McLaren, which he had graffitied to now read, "I hate Pink Floyd." Where the hippies wanted peace and love, the punks wanted to destroy everyone and everything. Where the hippies had shied away from conflict and become a bit bland and boring, the punks were incredibly aggressive and extremely interesting. The pendulum of British culture was ripe to be given a shove once again. A form of war was coming back into fashion. The Sex Pistols burst onto the scene in 1976, an explosion of rage and testosterone that seemed utterly unstoppable. Bizarrely, under the guidance of their Jewish manager, Malcolm McLaren, they even wore swastikas. You see how this still relates back to the Second World War? So let's see if, like Zeppelin and the Beatles before them, the Sex Pistols used the same 4 keys to become the biggest band in Britain. The Pistols were completely unique when it comes to key number 1, because did the Sex Pistols really have great songs? To me, they stand alone in this deep dive because when you listen to it in isolation, their music is an absolute racket. The Beatles made it on perhaps a 50-50 balance of music and message. Zeppelin made it on more of a 70-30 balance, the music being more prominent, the message perhaps a little more subdued. The Pistols, however, were 90% message, 10% music. They even went so far as to say in their first ever printed review in the NME, "We're not into music, we're into chaos." I can't think of any quote that sums it up better. They released only one mad but brilliant album in their short life as a band. Their antics, wild behaviour and the movement they inspired, however, remain equally or even better known than the songs themselves to this day. And their songs were, as you might expect, the absolute polar opposite of prog and what hippie music had become. Bands like Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd created incredibly advanced and complex music. The Sex Pistols did not. They didn't even really know how to properly play their instruments. But did they have great songs? When I first heard the Pistols as a teenager, I thought they were absolute rubbish. I was used to the songwriting genius of Noel Gallagher, and in isolation their stuff just didn't match up. But as I then got older and I learned their story, learned that their music was a reaction and massive middle finger to the whining, moping, entitled hippie generation, I started to understand it. And from there, I started to love it. Once you understand what they were rebelling against, once you understand their message, those songs are like dynamite. In isolation, they just sound like noise, but when you listen to them in light of punk, they send shivers down your spine. So for me personally, that's a massive tick for key number 1. And the Pistols also most definitely possessed the second key, a signature sound. Every song on their one album could only be that band. The instrumentation is almost exactly the same on every track. All that changes is the speed and the chords. But more importantly, once again, they had a completely unique character vocal in the form of Johnny Rotten, who sang in this mad, sneering, half-yelled, half-sung style. Just like the Beatles in their early days, just like Zeppelin in their early days, you didn't need to have heard the song before. As soon as you heard that instrumental backing with that vocalist, you instantly knew that's the Sex Pistols. Absolutely no one else sounded quite like that. But as we've touched on already, the music and their sound for the Pistols played a lowly second fiddle to the sheer overwhelming force of their countercultural message. They may not have been musical masters, but when it comes to key number 3, no one else even comes close. Many people look back on the hippies with a certain fondness. I know I did for years. Their philosophy on life seems nice enough, but there is another side to it, a side I didn't really understand until I watched this. It's a documentary on the Isle of Wight festival in 1970, and in this documentary you really get to see the dark side, the negative side of the hippies, which for me helped explain why the Pistols and the punks disliked them so much. It wasn't just that they didn't like their music or their dress sense, it was a bit deeper than that. 600,000 people showed up to the Isle of Wight festival in 1970, and only a tiny proportion of these actually paid for tickets. The rest of them spent the whole time trying to break down the outer fences, demanding to be let in for free. And yet the organisers had to pay for every aspect of the festival, including paying all the artists. In this documentary, the majority of the hippies really seemed to feel hard done by and mistreated when, after trying to force their way in without paying, they were stopped by security men with dogs.
That hill belongs to these people. It's National Trust land. It belongs to people. It doesn't belong to those motherfuckers up there who've got dogs, man. And it doesn't belong to those cats over there who've got the bread either. It's our land, man.
But where's that with this love festival thing? Where's all this peace? When that dog attacked me, there was no bloody love and peace in that.
Despite literally having tried to rob the organisers and break the law, they would just complain that they weren't being shown any peace or love.
It's fast becoming a people's festival, you know, and the people that are here are going to use this festival as they want, and they're going to use the facilities as they want, and, you know, if necessary, we're going to enter the festival ground.
Throughout the live sets from acts like Bob Dylan, Jimi Hendrix, The Who and The Doors, who would have been really expensive to book, the hippies were constantly banging on the barriers, disrupting the music and infuriating those on the inside who had actually paid to be there. In the end, through sheer persistence and overwhelming numbers, the crowds of hippies broke through the barriers and forced their way in without paying, resulting in this famous rant from one of the organisers.
We put this festival on, you bastards, with a lot of love. We worked for 1 year for you pigs. And you want to break our walls down? And you want to destroy it? Well, you go to hell!
The overwhelming crowds of belligerent, entitled hippies ruined any chance the organisers had whatsoever of even breaking even from putting on the event. And partly as a result of the absolutely massive, catastrophic financial failure of the Isle of Wight Festival in 1970, they weren't able to put on another festival in the same place for 32 years. After watching the documentary, I was just blown away by the self-indulgent, self-pitying attitude of most of the hippies. And I felt incredibly sorry for the organisers of the festival who'd had to put up with such an unbelievable bunch of whining morons. But it also helped me understand what the Sex Pistols were all about when they burst onto the scene 6 years later. Johnny Rotten famously said, "Never trust a hippie," and the Pistols really were the absolute antithesis of everything the hippie movement stood for. And, of course, just like Zeppelin and the Beatles before them, because their music was tied in to a new countercultural message, their songs became more than songs, they became timeless, because they were the soundtrack to the punk revolution. They took on immeasurable new emotional meaning because they were the message and the anthems of the next generation of disillusioned youth. In Anarchy in the UK, Johnny Rotten says, "I don't know what I want, but I know how to get it. I want to destroy the passerby." You can't get more countercultural in comparison to the hippie movement than that song. No wonder they set the whole country on fire. Paul Morley, who was at the Sex Pistols' famous first gig in Manchester in '76, said this: "The Pistols brought everything bang up to date. It was absolutely for you. It was about the times. You just had a gut instinct that this was about how you felt. It was nothing to do with pop music in that sense. It was much more than that. It was a big, bizarre philosophy being thrown at you, and that was incredibly exciting." You notice how he openly says that in one sense, it was nothing to do with the music. In a sense, their music was only ever the backdrop to their central message of, we want to offend as many people as possible, as often as possible, as much as possible. In a weird way, their huge surge in popularity was a sign that the UK had recovered from the wounds of war and was starting to get back into the fighting spirit once again. And you can really clearly see that distinction between the punks who were new and the hippies who were old in the first time the Pistols appeared on TV, thanks to Tony Wilson. These are the bands who were on first. And then, as if ushering in the new revolution, the Pistols finished the show singing Anarchy in the UK.
Get up,
They effectively looked at the nation and said, what is everyone saying right now? What is everyone thinking right now? What's considered nice? What's considered tolerant? What is considered socially acceptable? And then they went out and intentionally did the exact opposite. Their music became more than just songs because of how strongly they embraced key number 3, and there can be few other British bands that can lay such an indisputable claim to that key. And of course, the Pistols very much had key number 4, a dress code, a way for people to join this new movement. And that was, of course, punk clothing and punk hair. In the book I Swear I Was There, punk superfan John the Postman talks about what it was like seeing the Pistols for the first time. He says they certainly looked different. They had short hair for a kick-off, which was not the norm at the time at all. Most people had the long style hair of the Straights. The Pistols had short hair and despised people with long hair, calling them students. Just like the movement and the music, the punk dress code was designed for the maximum possible shock impact. Spiky green hair and leather bondage gear with safety pins in it. Genius manager Malcolm McLaren was behind their look, which not only inspired a generation, but also gave them a way to join in. The Pistols were as mad, wild and unpredictable as they seemed, and so their reign at the top was the shortest of these 4 bands we're looking at today, just 2 years. The Pistols dominated in 76 and 77, but then disintegrated in San Francisco in January 78. But what they were, what they did, their countercultural message, has meant that despite releasing just 1 album, they remain one of the most influential British bands of all time. And, as we've now seen, just like the Beatles and Zeppelin, they used the same 4 keys to do it. And now, last of all, let's move on to Oasis. And they are perhaps the most interesting of all 4 bands we're looking at today, because they combined the old with the new, utilising the best bits of what had come before and adding some of their own ingredients. I don't think anyone can dispute that they had the first key. Great songs. Noel Gallagher was probably the greatest British songwriter of the 90s. But in his songwriting during that decade, he did something really interesting. He would constantly reference the Beatles in his lyrics and in his music. The majority of Noel's songs in the 90s do something with chords that most Beatles songs do, and that is substituting out a major for a minor in an unexpected place. That's called using non-diatonic chords. Most of the cookie cutter pop songs in the 90s and today just use diatonic chords, which basically means you can play all of them with 6 chords and a capo. Which, in practical terms, means that most pop songs just use the same musical palette as a nursery rhyme. He used much more complex, interesting chord sequences which, as a result, gave birth to better melodies. Just as with the other 3 bands we've looked at today, history has shown that the Oasis songs from this period really have stood the test of time. So that is key number 1 with a tick. But what about key number 2? Particularly in their debut album Definitely Maybe, Oasis really did have a unique signature sound. And probably once again, they drew a lot of inspiration from the greats of the past. With the exception of the final track, you can pull the vocals out of every track on Definitely Maybe, and pretty much the instrumentation and the sound is exactly the same, just as it was with the Pistols and just as it was with the Beatles. The chords might change, the tempo might change, but the instrumentation remains the same. But once again, like the Beatles, like Zeppelin and the Pistols, the main feature of the band's unique sound was Liam Gallagher's unique character vocal. And once again, his style is strongly influenced by John Lennon and Johnny Rotten, by the Beatles and the Pistols. Producer Owen Morris even remarked to him during recording sessions for Definitely Maybe that he sang like a mix of the two. And in the 90s, I remember, Liam's voice was so signature, it was so recognisable that you could flip on the radio and even if you didn't know the song, you instantly knew that's Oasis. But, as always, great songs and a great sound were not enough. For those songs to become timeless, they needed to become entwined in a social revolution. They needed to become the soundtrack to a change in mainstream British society that the silent majority of people back then were longing for. And, of course, as history shows, they did. Oasis appeared on the scene in the UK in the early 90s at a time when male sensitivity was the hot ticket of the day, particularly amongst the popular American bands of that era. Oasis were considered to be part of the Big Four of Britpop, alongside Suede, Pulp and Blur. But if you look at the frontmen of the other three of the Big Britpop Four and the way they presented their image, I'm sure they were just being themselves and fair play, but you can see that they were all quite androgynous or camp, whereas Oasis were not in any way whatsoever. In that time, I remember they stood alone by being unapologetically male and laddish. And when you think about it, it kind of makes sense, because most blokes on the ground in the UK are not particularly androgynous or camp, and so we would listen to Suede and bands like that and perhaps really enjoy the music, but not automatically identify with them. Of course, I can't speak for everyone, but I personally didn't. Because of all the bands who were on the rise at that time, Oasis were the ones who appealed to the majority of the market. They were the ones who most ordinary, blokey blokes could see and identify with. Of course, they rose head and shoulders above the rest, because they appealed to the majority. It was unusual at that time to see a rock star who looked and behaved like an ordinary working class man, and so when a whole band of them crashed onto the scene, a formerly very neglected but absolutely massive part of British society suddenly had its representatives and spokesmen in the mainstream, and we all rallied to their flag. In a world of bands that had become increasingly nice and tolerant and respectful in the early 90s, Oasis did something very similar to what the Pistols did. They were agents of chaos.
You know, because really the music, fuck all that. Writing songs is difficult. Talking shit is easy. When I do an interview, I'm there to be a fucking gobshite and to cause as much fucking trouble as possible.
And just as Noel wrote songs with a huge influence from the Beatles, as if presenting himself to be the next chapter in that book, so their offstage behaviour also kind of presented them as the next chapter following The Who and the Pistols. Oasis's behaviour was very countercultural, controversial and incredibly exciting. For those of us at the time who found the kind of humble, self-effacing musicians of the day a bit dull and cliché, Oasis were a breath of fresh air. The pendulum was here, and they kicked it back in the opposite direction. And just like the other three bands we've looked at today, they lived their message, behaving like most ordinary working class lads would if they could get away with it. And because of that, they were absolutely magnetic. Just to get an idea of how strongly Oasis embraced key number 3, countercultural behaviour, just like the Pistols were, they were already notorious in the British press before they released any music. Just think about that for a second. Can you think of any band from the last 10 years who captured the public's attention by their behaviour before they'd even released their first single. The Amsterdam incident is a really good example of this. They were booked to perform in their first overseas gig, but showed up to the ferry drunk, shoplifted more booze from the duty free, and then started spending forged £50 notes at the ship bar. All of them except Noel, who was asleep, got into a brawl with the ship's police, got arrested, thrown in the brig, and then deported back to England as soon as the ferry arrived. Before releasing any music, they were already more interesting and countercultural than most British bands ever were at any point in their careers. There's a reason Creation Records boss Alan McGee responded to news of their arrest and deportation with just one word: brilliant. And that's because this incident alone probably brought them more fame and notoriety than a top 10 hit could have done. Don't forget, there were countless different artists releasing music in the 90s and achieving top 10 hits. How many of them can you name now? Many of them also consistently charted higher than Oasis, but today everyone remembers Oasis because their songs became more than just songs. They became something timeless.
The thing about getting thrown off ferries, blah blah blah, getting deported is something that I'm not proud about. Because
I am now.
Yeah, all right. Well, if you're proud about getting thrown off ferries, then why don't you go and support West Ham? Get the fuck out of my band and go be a football hooligan, right?
That is what occurred on that night, and it's like what fucking Bobby Gillespie said. He quoted something and he goes, "I'm sick of all these fucking bands who don't get in situations and that no more." The last band that got in proper shit was the Pistols and that. You know, like, they'd go out and like something had happened. And that's all it is. That's the way we are, or the way I am. Right?
It's not about you.
What the fuck are the Pistols then? Right, they're the most...
Who's talking about the Sex Pistols?
They're the best rock and roll band that ever fucking come about here.
They're not. They're not.
They are, they're one of them.
Right, they made one album.
But the fourth key with Oasis is really interesting to me, because they of course had a dress code, just like the other three bands, but just as they had channeled their heroes of the past in their songwriting, in their sound, in their offstage antics, so too they channeled their heroes of their past in the band dress code. The Oasis haircut was basically the Beatle haircut, with just a few small changes. And from 94 to 98, the streets of Britain were packed with lads with that same Gallagher hairdo. They also channeled the mod movement in their clothing. This is Quadrophenia. It's a film about the mods and the rockers, two musical subcultures that went to war in the 60s. I remember the first time I watched it going, "Hey, he's dressed like Liam Gallagher." The mods wear parkas and sunglasses and they ride scooters. In the album art for Definitely Maybe and Be Here Now, we see Liam Gallagher posing with a scooter. And the band constantly wore parkas to the point that Liam even started a clothing company with a specialism in them called Pretty Green. And the name of that company, Pretty Green, comes from a song by The Jam, the best known band of the mod father himself, Paul Weller. In every aspect of the four keys, Oasis brought something new and exciting to the table, but they also positioned themselves as the next phase in the stories of their rock and roll heroes. And it worked, because kids and adults alike could be seen up and down the country wearing parkas and sunglasses with an Oasis haircut. And at the real height of Britpop mania, there were even kids talking in fake Manchester accents. Oasis were leaders of their cultural revolution from 1995 to probably 1998. So around 4 years at the top. But, of course, the same thing happened to them as happened to the Beatles. They had their time at the top, gradually became the new normal, and then became cliché. I personally think Oasis could have stayed at the top for longer had they released some more music. But after Be Here Now, they went almost a full 3 years with no new music. And so, by the year 2000, when their fourth album was finally released, the cultural movement was over, and people were now getting a little bit embarrassed to admit they liked Oasis. The kings of Britpop had now become passé because they actually won the culture war. But what about now? Since Oasis, there hasn't really been anyone to fully capture the hearts and minds of the nation in quite the same way. There have been so many brilliant bands with brilliant music, but the path to the top of the rock and roll world in the UK is not brilliant music alone. If that was the case, then session musicians and composers would be selling out Nebworth. Remember, of the 4 bands we've looked at today, all of them had some absolutely rubbish songs. If you want to be the next great British band, you need to enter the culture war. You need to become an agent of chaos. So, could it be you? Take a look at British culture today and ask yourself, what has become the new normal? What has become the new boring? You need to remember that the media, generally speaking, is several years behind. They're usually representing in print, on TV, online, what was current in the thinking of the people about 3 years ago. So it's worth asking yourself, what is everyone on TV saying? What is everyone in the mainstream media saying? And most importantly, what things are the majority of people on the ground secretly getting absolutely sick of? Because whatever it is, you need to position yourself in opposition to that. It can be gentle, charming opposition, like the Beatles, or explosive, aggressive open warfare, like the Pistols. You've got to sense the voices that are being silenced and stamped out, and then embody them. The mainstream media tend to embody where the pendulum is now, so if what you stand for just matches that, unfortunately, you're probably one of the squares. The idea of being radically countercultural is scary today. It's a difficult idea to dedicate your life and musical career to, isn't it? It takes incredible bravery and confidence to do it, and that's why it's so rare. If it was easy, everyone would be doing it. So if you think you might be the one to usher in the next wave of rock and roll revolution, it comes at a price. You have to be willing to stick your neck out and risk being cancelled, because that is one of the most important parts of key number 3 that I've left till last. Cancel culture is not a new thing. It's always existed, and all 4 of those bands had to fight against it. The Beatles were slammed by politicians and told they were corrupting the youth of Britain. Lennon said the Beatles were bigger than Jesus, and as a result they were dropped from countless radio stations in America where mass burnings of their records were held. That sounds very much like cancel culture to me. Led Zeppelin were consistently attacked and slammed by the press and the mainstream media in their day, to the point that they just stopped working with them in any way whatsoever, reasoning that they were better off fully operating outside of the ordinary music press. And of course, time and history proved that the band and their fans were right, and the mainstream media got it wrong. The Pistols were dropped by EMI for swearing on TV, repeatedly banned from venues, and had to be billed under code names by promoters to not have their gigs pulled. They were one of the most revolutionary, and so one of the most cancelled bands in British history. Oasis were banned from hotel chains, constantly criticised on news programmes, and repeatedly on the receiving end of outrage from the press. They were banned from airlines and whole chains of hotels. All 4 of the bands we've looked at today were at the mercy of cancel culture in their day, and whoever the next great rock and roll band is, they will be as well. It's simply a reality you have to embrace. It's not nice, it's not safe, it's a risk, and it's a gamble. But this is a time of opportunity, because in Britain right now, the pendulum is here once more, and the people are bored of the new normal. So if you're out there, the next great British band, ready to push that pendulum and ride the wave all the way to the top, I don't think I'm alone in saying, count me in, I'm ready. Most bands and musicians today sound good, but are utterly boring. The most rock and roll people in the country right now are just a very small selection of stand-up comedians. And you can tell which ones because they're usually the most famous. Why wouldn't they be? They're saying what everyone's thinking. But when did musicians hand over the rock and roll baton to the bloody stand-ups? We need some punk ethic back in music. We need bands with more than great songs. We need bands with edge. Bands who are going to inspire everyone by behaving in the way we wish we could behave. I personally can't wait for the next agents of chaos to emerge, ready to lead that charge. Because whoever you are and wherever you are, I can't wait to hear what you've got to sing, and I can't wait to hear what you've got to say.